Thank you all for participating. Senator Thune and I are working together on this piece of legislation, but for the benefit of all the young people in the room, including all the reporters, I've been involved in Taxpayer Bill of Rights going back to the father of the most recent Senator Pryor, because the elder Pryor and I worked together in the 1980s and 90s on Taxpayer's Bill of Rights. Nobody in our country is happy to hear from the IRS. Taxpayer confidence is that if you're dealing with any government agency, but particularly the IRS, every citizen ought to get a fair shake. And this fair shake has been shattered recently by the IRS. And you can understand with a system of taxation that's based upon voluntary reporting that if people lose confidence in the IRS and its system, that system of voluntary reporting could collapse. In recent years, as you know, we've seen inappropriate action by some IRS employees, and that has shaken the confidence that people have had in the agency, and it's weakened now. Our bill ensures safeguards to protect taxpayers' rights by preventing IRS abuses. It does it two ways: by putting in some new taxpayer rights, and it updates and strengthens those in the existing law that I've already referred to. Now, we all understand that no law is going to change all the shortcomings. So I go back to something I just said on the Senate floor about the Department of Defense. Change is going to have to come from the outside if we're going to change the culture at the IRS, but that culture must change. We hope that this legislation will help in that direction. We can't tolerate systemic abuse of taxpayers' rights. We also want our legislation to serve as a conversation starter for ideas on further ways to reform the IRS to better serve the taxpayers. In the coming months, the Finance Committee is likely to release a bipartisan report on IRS targeting. We suspect the findings of the report will reveal further areas the IRS ripe for reform. We know that many of our colleagues also have ideas. So we hope that besides what we specifically think needs to be done through this legislation, that we hope that it encourages dialogue to make sure that every problem's dealt with. And I thank Senator Thune for his work in this area. And I don't need to tell you that he's an advocate for making sure that government performs the way the taxpayers expect it to perform.
Thank you, Senator Grassley. And I'd like to think that I'm one of those young people that Senator Grassley was referring to a moment ago. But he has had, as he pointed out, a long record of accomplishment on these issues going back to 1986, 1996, 1998. And my first association with this issue was in 1998 when I was a congressman on the House side, but we did some reforms, some IRS reforms. But that's almost 20 years ago, and it's long overdue. It's high time that we look at what we can do to restore the confidence of the American people in the IRS. I think, unfortunately, the IRS here of late has forgotten that the S in IRS stands for service. And that's certainly something that we want to remind them about. And I think that this legislation, which I'm very pleased to be able to work with Senator Grassley on, is put some protections in place, make sure that the rights of the taxpayers in this country are being protected. No American ought to have to worry that their confidential information gets disclosed, like we saw with the leaks from the IRS to ProPublica. No American ought to have to worry about being targeted because of their political beliefs, which is what happened with the conservative social welfare groups that Senator Grassley mentioned earlier. And no American ought to have to worry that the IRS is going to violate the rules when it comes to retention of emails, employee emails, that every other federal agency has to abide by. Those are all abuses that have occurred just here in the last few years, but they compound problems that go a long ways back. And that's why a taxpayer bill of rights is so important. And this legislation puts in place some protections, makes it clear that it will, in addition to the 10 the Bill of Rights, the protections that are in the Bill of Rights that the administration announced last year, adds to that you cannot target conservative groups or groups that you don't agree with when it comes to making decisions with regard, as we saw, to a lot of these tax-exempt organizations that were applying to try and get status from the IRS and that were delayed by the IRS. So those are the types of things that we want to prevent from happening in the future. These are the kinds of protections that we want to have in place so that the American people can know that the agency that's responsible for collecting taxes in this country is going to be fair, going to respect their rights as taxpayers, going to operate in an even-handed way, and make sure that we don't have the kinds of abuses that we've seen here, not only of late, but that go on sometimes an ongoing basis when you hear from taxpayers across your states, constituents that you represent, and their experiences dealing with this agency. So I'm delighted to be able to be a co-sponsor with Senator Grassley. I hope that we can get some action on the Finance Committee and ultimately on the floor of the United States Senate, because, as I said, it's long overdue. 1998 is the last time we addressed this issue. A lot's happened since then, and a lot's happened just in the last few years. And I hope that I hope we can get some action to change the direction, change the trajectory, change the culture at the IRS in a way that will be good for the American taxpayer, who, after all, are the people that pay the bills for this country.
There's a question there.
Yes, sir.
If you could talk a little bit about how this marries up with what the House has been doing and how you see this getting to the finish line.
I'm not sure I can answer that specifically, but I know the IRS, or the whole impetus for all this happened as recently as 2 or 3 years ago when the Lois Lerner thing and things like that came up, and the House of Representatives have had more hearings than we've had on that issue. I assume we're headed in the same direction, but I don't have a specific answer for you.
No, I don't know that we know that for sure either. Yeah. But I do think the Senator Grassley mentioned the IRS, the Lois Lerner investigations that have been done, coupled with the Finance Committee investigation, I think will provide the impetus for action on Capitol Hill, and certainly, hopefully, some action by the Senate Finance Committee and the full Senate.
Have you scheduled a hearing at the Finance Committee for this bill? Do you have any co-sponsors in the Senate?
No co-sponsors at this point, but we will be, I'm sure we'll get a lot of co-sponsors, and no request for a hearing yet. But here's where it might come in very easily. It won't be long until Senator Hatch will be bringing forth some information of the investigation of what's been going on with the computers and the email and all the nonprofit organizations and the political harassment and all that, and that'd be a perfect time for the details of our legislation to be discussed in the very least, and I think Senator Thune and I would make sure that that's a part of it. But I think that Senator Hatch, I haven't talked to him about our legislation, but I would think that with all the problems at the IRS and knowing where Senator Hatch generally feels, that he would look favorably upon at least the approach of our legislation, not meaning that he would be in favor of every detail in it and things of that nature.
Yes, sir.
The IRS has already done a lot of this stuff themselves through just administrative action. Why do you think legislation is necessary to just strengthen it, or to just sort of put it in place permanently? Is that essentially what you're thinking?
Basically, yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's important to codify this stuff. This is nothing's been done on this since 1998 by Congress. There have been administrations, but administrations come and administrations go. And you know, there's no guarantee when you don't have the strength of legislative language that a lot of these sort of proposals that are advanced or put forward by the administration ultimately are going to stand the test of time. And the only way to ensure that is to have legislative action, and a taxpayer bill of rights is a great way to do that. So we, and as Senator Grassley mentioned, we've not, the Finance Committee, the staff's aware of what we're doing, and this has been socialized on some levels there, but I'm hopeful that we'll be able to get, as Chuck mentioned, lots of co-sponsors. I think this will be a popular issue with a lot of people.
And you probably understand that past taxpayers' Bill of Rights have been parts of larger tax bills, I think, in every instance, as I recall. And so that's probably will be, if we're successful, where this will be an outcome.
The National Society of Accountants just this morning released what they're calling a tax practitioner's Bill of Rights. That includes provisions that are supposed to be protecting the interests of the taxpayers and the practitioners who file about 60% of individual returns. And they include things like the right to have tax laws affecting the current tax year enacted no later than September 1st of that year. The right to have telephone calls answered within 15 minutes on the practitioner-only hotline. The right to have an IRS audit moratorium during the 3 weeks immediately before the major tax deadline, such as March 15th, April 15th, September 15th, and October 15th. There are some other ones on there as well. What do you think of some of those ideas, or just the idea in general of a tax practitioner's set of rights?
Well, I think we would welcome dialogue with them, as I suggested in my ending comments on my remarks, and as we do from a lot of other people. This is, we wouldn't pretend to have the last word, but we think we're dealing with things that are pretty obvious. Beyond that, let people talk to us.
A lot of this is probably stuff that has been bipartisan in the past, but these days anything with the IRS has seemed to cause some partisan conflict. And Democrats don't seem to be on the same page with you guys as to how much reform the IRS needs. Do you think that this is something that is going to continue? I mean, that could move in a bipartisan manual, or that Democrats, I mean, have Democrats shown willingness to work with you on this type of bill?
I can't speak in depth about that, but I can tell you what the practice has been of every taxpayer's Bill of Rights before now. It's been bipartisan.
Yeah, and I think there should be bipartisan support. The types of things that we're suggesting are, I think, very practical, you know, grounded in common sense. Obviously, updating the penalties for improper conduct is something that needs to be done after almost 20 years. And the last time this was done in 1998, you had a Republican House and Senate, but you had a Democrat in the White House. So I think this is the kind of thing that ought to be bipartisan. As you mentioned, it's very hard in this day and age, even though the most basic, simple tasks tend to kind of devolve into partisan conflict. But whether or not, you know, however this gets portrayed politically, you cannot argue that based on the record we've had in the last few years here, that it isn't high time for Congress on both sides of the aisle to put in place some laws that protect taxpayer rights. I think that's a fairly fundamental, should be hopefully a shared belief here in the Senate.
One other question, just in looking at the details a little bit here, some of this stuff seems to speak to more than just taxpayer rights. I mean, there's things about corporate estimated tax, individual estimated tax. I wonder what the potential is for legislation like this to kind of reach out into some other areas like that. Talk a little bit about how it could grow a little bit maybe into some other things, I wonder.
Well, right now, we're going to settle with what we're introducing and be open to conversation with others, and I'm not going to prejudge anything at this point.
It does offer some opportunities, doesn't it?
Well, you know, the way the Senate operates on Finance Committee bills, you put some little tax bill out there and every other tax bill is going to be amended to it. The House has the right under their system to not even have the bill amended. Most tax bills aren't amended in the House. So You know, this is a deliberative body, and anybody can do almost anything they want to until, even with non-germane amendments, till cloture is invoked.
And it's possible it could hitch a ride on something. You know, there might be other types of bills moving through the Finance Committee or to the floor.
You mentioned that part of the impetus for this is, or like a possible push to get it done, is the upcoming release of the Finance Committee's investigation report. I know you guys are waiting on TICTA to finalize their investigation, but they said to you guys earlier that it'll be done at the end of June. So if that comes, say, this summer, do you think that there's going to be a push to do more reforms beyond just a taxpayer bill of rights, like a broader IRS type of reform legislatively? Maybe not, I don't know, 98 was the last time something was done that big, but I don't know how broad. We haven't seen the report. So, I mean, have you seen the report? Do you know if broader legislative reforms are needed beyond the Bill of Rights?
Well, I haven't seen the report. I don't know, maybe
No, I have not.
Chuck's been around. He might have inside sources that give him access to that kind of information. But no, I haven't seen the report. But I do think that it does, all these things, this convergence of just kind of circumstances right now, I think provide the foundation and perhaps the environment to do something meaningful. And perhaps it's broader IRS reforms than what we're talking about here, and that will probably be shaped to some degree, at least, by what those reports consist of and what recommendations come out of them. But I think the timing is right to do this, and the fact that there's going to be a TIGTA and hopefully a Finance Committee report coming out soon suggests the timing, I think, is going to be right for this.
I think we'll call it quits. Thank you all very much.